One of the things that we discover in our gospel this morning is that doubt can block out blessings. Certainly that's what happened to Thomas, who carries the tag Doubting Thomas, and we've heard that over and over and over again, doubting the word of his fellow disciples, that they had seen the risen Lord when he came and stood in their midst in the room where they had gathered. And doubting their word, now Thomas was going to have to wait to know the joy that filled them as Jesus came and stood in their midst. He'd have to wait to know the joy of the risen Lord that we celebrated here last Sunday, proclaiming and raising our voices. He is risen indeed. Thomas would have to wait. He would have to wait to be blessed by the living presence of the Lord. And he made it very clear what needed to happen in order for him to receive that blessing. He would not believe unless he would see the mark of the nails in Jesus' hands and put his finger there, and unless he could take his hand and put it in Jesus' side. And so today from our gospel reading, we see that we are brought to that moment when Jesus once again comes in the presence of the disciples, and Thomas is there, seeing the mark of the nails and putting his finger in it, his hand in Jesus' side. And Jesus looking at him and saying, Thomas, do not doubt, but believe. And Thomas did. My Lord and my God. Just think what a moment like that must have been for him. His moment had arrived. It arrived because the intent of Jesus for him, for all of the disciples, the intent of Jesus for us is to always seek us out, to restore faith and belief when it is wavering the most, is no longer able to be held onto by ourselves, our own being. You see, it's then that Jesus, the risen Lord, comes to melt the clouds of doubt away, as one of our hymns put it, showering us with his presence and his blessings that are always here for us, as much as they were always there for Thomas. When we are wrapped up in doubt, and that certainly can happen, can no longer believe for whatever reason in the living and caring presence of God at any given moment in our life, it is as impossible for us as it was for Thomas to generate within our own being blessings that can only come from the presence of the risen, resurrected Lord, seeking to offer us his blessings, blessings that never run dry, seeking us when we give up on him, never, ever, ever giving up on us, doing what it takes to find our heart and bringing us back into his holy presence. As he did for Thomas, Jesus might possibly come as Thomas needed him to in order to believe. Remember, Thomas said, I will not believe unless this and this and this happens. Jesus might come that way. But more than likely, Jesus will come to seek us out in unexpected ways to restore unbelief. Belief when it is shattered. When faith is low as it can be, the resurrected Lord comes pursuing us to restore our belief and pour out his blessings of life. And I know this personally to be true because I have been there more than once. He comes, just as he did for a young couple, Jim and Susan, in one of my former parishes. In their story, we can see even today how Jesus comes as real for them as he did for Mary at the tomb, for the disciples in that room, and for doubting Thomas. You see, Susan had a miscarriage in her first pregnancy. And it was really tough on her and her husband, Jim, but after a while they realized that healing could take place and they would try for another child. And it was several months when that did take place, and she became pregnant, and everything went well through the whole pregnancy. And when the child was due, they decided, with the advice of the doctor, because there seemed to be a little delay, that they would induce labor and set a time. And they did. But early that morning, I received a frantic call from Susan's mother, who along with her husband were also members of my congregation. And she said, "Please, Pastor, come as soon as you can to the hospital. Something is terribly wrong." Well, Susan had awakened in the middle of the night to feel her tummy, and great fear came over her since she could feel no movement, could sense no life in her womb. She woke Jim, and he called the hospital, and they rushed her, but it was too late. The umbilical cord had twisted somehow or other around the neck of the little one, and so it took its life. And when I walked into the room, the baby was in the arms of Susan, she having asked the doctor if it was okay if she could just hold her daughter for a little while. So beautiful, so perfect, so tiny, there in her mother's arms as if she was just simply asleep. Well, needless to say, the repercussions were tremendous in the following months for this couple. Frustration, anger, hurt, everything that kept them and Susan's parents from coming back to worship in the church. Their belief was shattered. During one of the many times that I visited and stopped in to see Jim and Susan, about 6 months or more after the baby's death, they shared that what was happening was destroying them as well as their parents. The joy and family laughter that they always had when they all got together was gone. She said, "It's falling apart in many ways, even between myself and Jim." And Susan went on to tell how bitter her dad had become, saying, "There is no God. There can't be a God if this were to happen." Expressed his hatred for the church and everything that it stood for. About all the lies that he had heard from the pulpit over and over again about a loving, caring, precious Jesus, not there. And he vowed he'd never step inside the church again. Jim and Susan spent a lot of time talking about this. And though they had not yet resolved their own feelings about what had happened or resolved their own faith issues regarding it, they knew something had to be done. They said, "God, he can't want it to continue on this way, to have the family as a whole destroyed." And so they asked if it would be okay on the following Sunday, if they would come to church, but come after the church service had already started. And there was a way for them to go back into the church and up in the balcony where no one sat anyway. And they said if they got up there and they couldn't make it through the service, would it be okay? Would it be okay if they just quietly left with no one seeing them? And of course I told them, it is okay. It'd be wonderful to have you there. I didn't see them, and I kept kind of looking up in the balcony until reading of the second lesson. And there they were sitting alone, and it was one of the loneliest sights that I have seen in my life. But what I didn't happen to mention to you was that Susan's mom had stopped by the church the day after we had had this conversation about them coming. You see, she did this once in a while. Deep in her heart, she wanted to come back into the fellowship, just never took the step. And I told her, and I asked her not to say anything. I told her what Jim and Susan were going to do, and if she would simply do one thing, and that is to hold them in her prayers, and she said absolutely. And though she kept her promise and did not say anything to Susan and Jim, I was aghast that Sunday as I happened to look out over the congregation and see in the back row Susan's parents, and not only her parents, but Jim's parents as well, and they were not even members of the congregation. And then it was like a light bulb went on, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is Communion Sunday. What if Jim and Susan decide to come down for communion? What would it do to them to see their parents sitting there? Would they think that they had been betrayed, that I went ahead and just set this all up? And I wondered, can I get the word to the ushers, but just about the time you want to, they're not any place where you would be able to do that. Nothing, ushers, I know you do a good job. I'm not nailing that. But it just so happened, I thought, could there be some way out of this? But I wasn't able to make contact. The ushers went down the aisle like they do here, motioning for you to come forward for communion. They got to the last row and they motioned for Susan's mom and dad and Jim's mom and dad to come and have communion, but they just sat there. They would not come forward. And then I looked up, and the balcony was empty, and an usher was bringing Susan and Jim down for communion. And as they turned the corner, their parents stood up and went out and took their hand. And they walked with them down that center aisle. And there were tears in their eyes as they knelt at the rail, held their hands as they received the blessing and the body of the living, resurrected Lord, whose presence we declare within our faith. When we receive this sacrament, as they did this morning, the living, resurrected Lord is in, with, and under this gift when it is offered and it is taken. To proclaim it is one thing. To witness this presence of the risen, living Lord at work in his supper for this family was another. Bringing unity to the body. And I saw Susan's father, his face that had been so intense just kind of melted like butter in the sun. Restored faith, restored belief, being together in the communion of Christ. As the Lord of Easter came to Mary at the tomb so she could believe, to the disciples so they could believe, to Thomas, to the family of Susan and Jim, it is the same Lord who comes to us as we go to his table this morning, offering to each of us his body and blood as the risen Lord to bless us with his living presence this hour and forevermore.